Did you have a tooth fairy pillow growing up? I had one that my Grammy made me, and after a mold incident in storage, this is all that's left of it. I just recently turned it into a patch for my junk jacket, but I'm on a mission to recreate some of the lost elements from my childhood, so I wanted to make a new version. Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a fashion designer and art historian. I make lots of things using vintage fabrics. I do offer things for sale, but lately, the two things I hear the most often are 1. I love what you do, but I can't afford it, and 2. I'd really like to learn how to sew for myself. So, instead of trying to sell you things all the time, I'm pivoting a bit to help you learn to sew some of the things that I make. I really want to remove a lot of the intimidation that comes along with learning how to sew, and hopefully teach you something about history and entertain you a little bit too. Welcome to Outer Child. I don't actually know anyone else who had a tooth fairy pillow, so for the longest time I really thought it was something my Grammy made up, but it's a concept that's been around since at least mid-century in the US. But where did it start? Well, there are a lot of cultures that celebrate the loss of a first tooth as a rite of passage. The first recorded mention of a baby tooth in exchange for something came in the form of Old Norse poetry, which is really hard to date, but it is pre-10th century. There was a mention of a tooth fee when a child lost its first tooth. In medieval Europe, baby teeth were burned to prevent people having to seek out all of their missing teeth after death, because never forget that teeth are outside bones. And there are many legends that say if you're buried without all of your bones, then you'll never rest easily. Yeah, so maybe a lot of the importance on teeth is down to the fact that they're bones. And bones, even temporary ones, are sacred to a lot of people. So no wonder there's so much legend and history there. In some countries, baby teeth are taken from under your pillow by a little mouse. In other cultural traditions, baby teeth are thrown skyward, downward, on the roof, in the water, and sometimes buried. Now, the tooth fairy as we know it in America today is a relatively new concept. And it is built on all these traditions, but it took on a life of its own starting in the early 20th century. The first written mention of the tooth fairy is largely attributed to Lillian Brown, who wrote this in the Chicago Tribune in 1908. Many a refractory child will allow a loose tooth to be removed if he knows about the tooth fairy. If he takes the little tooth and puts it under the pillow when he goes to bed, the tooth fairy will come on in the night and take it away, and in its place will leave some little gift. Now, who is Lillian Brown? I don't know. She's just a lady. She wrote into the Practical Housekeeper's Own Page, which was a reader-driven women's section of the newspaper. In 1927, we have another appearance of the Tooth Fairy in the form of a 3-act play written by Esther W. Arnold. This is the first modern story of the Tooth Fairy as we know her. You can read the whole story at the link in the description if you think you have the constitution to suffer a play written for children to perform in the 1920s. Through the 1930s, there were various random mentions in these women's columns of the tooth fairies and other fairies that mothers used to keep children calm during duress, like the measles fairy and whatnot. By 1938, there was a Little Rascals short called The Awful Tooth, about a good fairy that leaves a dime under Buckwheat's pillow in exchange for a tooth. But the one that seems to really have blown the popularity of the Tooth Fairy into the stratosphere was a 1948 story in Collier's Magazine by Lee Rogow. At the time, the magazine had about 3 million readers, and with the newly gained post-war affluence, the average American family could afford to spare a dime. So it really took off from there. The Tooth Fairy remained a common household name and was celebrated in pop culture from then on, and items like Tooth Fairy boxes and pillows were introduced. So today, we're going to learn the basics of sewing a pillow, but we're also going to add a little pocket for a tooth and talk about ways we can customize it. So you can see this is the fabric of my original Tooth Fairy pillow made by my Grammy. Well, a few years back, I thrifted this vintage bedsheet, and one of the main reasons that I grabbed it was because it did remind me of this fabric that my Grammy used on the Tooth Fairy pillow. As you can see, I made a shirt and a fancy bow back when I thrifted the bedsheet, so I thought I'd wear that today while we sew my new Tooth Fairy pillow. Now, my Grammy taught me plenty of creative crafts, but I was never allowed to touch the forbidden sewing machine. Being legally allowed to drive a car was not even enough for her to trust me on her machine. So, the first time I actually used a sewing machine was in high school, like in the actual school. In my teen era, we were on the last gasp of what they used to call home economics class. I had absolutely no interest in the rest of the coursework, but I knew there was a section on sewing and that I would finally learn to use the coveted sewing machine. The first thing I learned to sew on a machine was a pillow. It's a simple project, but it made me feel like a magician. It was the first time I could really wrap my head around the concept of taking two flat pieces of fabric and transforming them into something completely different. So I thought a good place to start teaching others would be with the pillow project. Another good beginner-friendly feature of this project is that tooth fairy pillows are typically miniature pillows. So it's a really quick and easy project to give you some confidence that you can actually make something totally new out of a few flat pieces of fabric. For this project, you really only need a small bit of fabric, an iron, a straight stitch on your sewing machine, and some polyfill stuffing. You can always make it bigger, you can use a pillow form, you can accessorize it with some trim and ruffles and whatever embellishments you'd like, and I'll show you that too. But first, let's make just a small, simple one, just to turn ourselves into magicians real quick. To start, I'm going to use woven 100% cotton fabric with no stretch. This will make it easier as a beginner project because working with fiddly and stretchy fabrics is not very beginner friendly. If you want to download the template from my website, you can do that for free. The link is down there in the description. Down there if you click on that right there. First, you'll cut two pieces of fabric that are 5 inches by 5 inches because that's the size I'm choosing for the mini pillow. Along with that, you're going to cut one square that's 6 inches by 3 inches, and that's going to end up being the pocket. You can cut the template right out of the page, or you can just use a ruler to measure it straight onto the fabric and mark it off, however you want to do it. But while I'm cutting this, I want to think about the scale of the print on my fabric and what parts of the print I want to showcase in the final project. You see, if I cut a 5-inch square in a random place, I could be losing a lot of the print, and I want to maintain it. So maybe you want to center that 5-inch square just so, and also think about how you want your pocket to feature too. Remember that it's going to be in the center front of your final project. So do you want it to have a specific focal point? It helps me sometimes to trace my template onto tracing paper, parchment paper, or even some random piece of plastic trash like this. That way you can see through it and you know that you're getting the part of the print that best showcases your vision for the final project. Once you have your 3 pieces, we're going to hem the raw edges of our pocket piece. So you take that to the ironing board, fold it in half with right sides facing, and press. Now you're going to stitch around the open edges using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Remember to leave the indicated opening. You're going to backstitch when starting and stopping. I'm using a contrasting thread so you can see it better. And sometimes that can have a nice effect. You can be playful with your thread. It doesn't always have to be an exact match. Snip your corners and trim up around if needed. Then, use the opening to turn the pocket right side out. Gently push the corners out with a point turner and press the seams flat. You'll now have a square that's about 3¼ inches. Remember to pay attention to which direction you want the top of your pocket to be. The top seam is where you're about to top stitch it down. It should be the side that has the little opening in it right now, but if not, that's okay. Just pick the top and add a row of stitching straight across at the 1/4 inch mark. Okay, now go back to your main panels and center the pocket with the right side up in the middle of your front main pillow body piece and pin it into place. Both sides will be right sides facing up. Again, pay attention to the way you want your print facing if that matters to you. Now you're going to sew the pocket directly onto the main pillow body piece. Just sew the 3 remaining sides. The top that you already top stitched will not get stitched down because that's going to be the opening of the pocket. To turn the corners, make sure the needle is down and pressed through the fabric before you lift the presser foot and pivot the fabric. Now you have a pocket attached. Place the second piece of the main pillow body on top of the piece that you just sewed the pocket on, with the right sides facing, and pin that into place. Now, this is one of the biggest reveals in learning to sew that's really going to stick with you. A lot of the time, you're working on the inside of the project, and it seems confusing and messy, but you're doing it that way so the outside stays neat. Now, you're going to stitch around your pillow, but again, just make sure to leave that indicated opening at the bottom. Use a backstitch when you start and stop. The opening needs to be big enough for you to stuff the pillow once it's flipped right side out. So I use the pocket corners as a guideline of where to leave the opening on this one. Now snip the corners and trim the seams neatly. Just a little. If you cut too close to the seam, you may accidentally cut the thread and then you'll have to start over. I usually don't trim the excess at the opening unless it's a lot. I leave that just a little bit longer right there, and you'll see why. Now, gently push out all the corners and press the seams, just like you did when you were making the pocket piece. Now it's time to stuff it with the polyfill. You can use your fingers or a pokey thing. I often use the end of a paintbrush. The bags of fiberfill come with these pokey sticks sometimes. Just be careful not to poke too hard with the pointy part because I've definitely poked all the way through before, and now I'm just saying poke way too much. So get all that fluff fluffed up and evenly distributed. And now we have to close the opening. You can see, since I didn't trim it there, it folds in pretty nicely when I just gently pull it at each side. You can hand sew the seam closed with a needle and thread, with a little whip stitch or a standard straight stitch, but what I usually do is just use a few drops of fabric glue, just a little bit so it doesn't ooze, just takes a drop. Then you can clip it closed until it's dry, or if you're using my favorite glue, Fabri-Tac, it's almost instantly dry. Like it's a very tacky glue, so it holds very fast and it doesn't get all hard when it's dried like some glues do. And there you have it. You have a pillow in which to collect the outside bones of small children for perfectly normal reasons. And you've performed the magic trick of turning a few flat, limp pieces of material into a 3D usable object. How the hell does it feel? Are you drunk with power yet? Because I know I am. So now I'm going to make the pillow I really want to make. I'm going to make the same thing we just did, but on a larger scale, which is more of a recreation of the actual pillow I used to have growing up. I'm going to go with about a 10 by 10 inch square to start, and I'm going to use the same concept for the pocket, but I'm going to make it a butterfly. I'm also going to add some ruffle trim because my original one had some eyelet ruffle lace trim, and I have a huge amount of this floofy lace ruffle for some reason, so we're just going to use that. Just a quick tip, if your chosen fabric is a bit thin like mine is because it's a vintage bedsheet, you can beef it up a little by double layering it with some muslin. This works well if you want to use a gauzier fabric too. Just make sure the muslin or interfacing that you choose is a similar weight to the fabric that you're using. I'm double layering it here because the lace trim is beefy and my vintage bedsheet fabric is very, very fine. Just like when you combine fabrics, you have to think about the weight of any of the embellishments and how they're going to affect the final project. My fabric needs a little bit more bulk, or this thick ass trim is just going to really pull it out of shape. So for the pocket, I'm going to use one of these butterflies. I'm going to cut one out and iron some heat and bond light to the back. This is an iron-on adhesive and stabilizer, and I use it a lot for appliques and patches. I'm going to cut around the shape, not with my fabric shears, because this is paper-backed and literally glue, so I don't want to use my fabric scissors. That's one sewing rule I'm really a stickler about, fabric only for the fabric scissors. Now I'm going to peel off the paper backing of the heat and bond, and I'm going to iron it onto another fusible stabilizer. This is fusible fleece, and I'm really only using it because I don't have white felt right now. If I had white felt, I would just iron it right onto that, but this is very close. So with that all trimmed up, I'm going to move to the machine and I'm going to do a tiny zigzag stitch all the way around. You can see the finishing it gives. It's kind of like an embroidered patch. I'm going to place my patch directly onto the front of my main pillow panel, just like last time, and sew around the outside of this patch, making sure to leave an opening for the pocket. Now I'm going to sew that bulky ass trim to this same piece. It's another instance of working on the inside for the future benefit of the outside. So I will line up the trim along the edge, but it'll face inward instead of out right now. I'll go all the way around, pinning it as I go, and I'll leave just about an inch excess on both ends, and I'll pin them together like that. Now, when I sew this trim on, I'm going to follow the basting stitch in the trim itself because that's about the right seam allowance and it gives me a good guideline and it will ensure that I'm catching all the layers of the pillow and this trim in my stitch. I sew that all the way around, and when I come back to my inch or so on the end, I'm just going to sew them together with right sides facing and trim off the excess. Then I sew that part down too. Now, just like last time, I have to top that all off with the remaining piece of the main pillow body. So, with right sides facing, I sandwich all that lace trim in there and I wrestle it in there and I make sure it all stays facing the same direction. Okay, now that we have all of that sandwiched in, I'm going to sew around the pillow again. And I'm going to sew right over or just outside of that exact same line I already sewed when I sewed it to attach the lace. And again, say it with me, make sure to leave the opening for stuffing. Once it's sewn, I'll clip the corners and I'll trim up any wild edges and bulk as needed before I flip it right sides out and get my poking stick. And then again, we gently push out the corners like we have before. And then we're ready to stuff it. Now the only thing left to do is close the seam. And just like before, you can hand sew it closed or use fabric glue. And honestly, I'm exhausted from hefting this very substantial lace trim all over the room, so I'm going to use fabric glue and be done. Now I'm a mega magician, and you will be too. Just keep playing and practicing and trying new things. Get acquainted with the seam ripper. I use it almost every day, and in fact, I had to use it a little bit too on this project to redo a place where this trim got really out of line with me, but you just didn't see it because my phone was dead. So yeah, I'm a disaster, and if I can do this, you can do this. I'm so happy with my recreation of my Tooth Fairy pillow. It really reminds me of the original, and it feels like something that Grammy would have made. And even though I'll never need a Tooth Fairy pillow again, something inside of me just healed. Let me know if you try this, or if you already have one, or if you've never heard of a Tooth Fairy pillow at all and you think I'm insane. Also, let us all know if you have any different traditions in your family when it comes to losing baby teeth. And follow along with me at Outer Child as I work to recreate all the nostalgic things that remind me of who I am and where I came from, and as I create new traditions and keepsakes for myself using old things.